Thank you, Ewan, for I think a really comprehensive analysis and some nice differentiation, I think, of what each key Southeast Asian player has to offer and its limitations as well, including as a partner. I liked that there was a bit of policy advice for the Australian government in there, given that the Australian taxpayer has been involved very much with this event. I hope folks were listening to that interesting advice. We've got some time now for some questions from you, and I look forward to some of your questions. There's a few other thoughts I'll try to inject if I get a chance, but I think there's a lot of expertise gathered in this room. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll try to see you in the gloom. I think you've got one over there. That's great. We'll start in the middle of the room. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Lee Cordner from the University of Adelaide. Enjoyed both presentations very much, thank you. Very thought-provoking. And it raised a whole lot of questions in my mind. I'm not going to try and ask all of them, but I'll touch on a couple of them. Raja Mohan, you talked about the new maritime imperative for India, and I've also read your book, Samudra Manthan, where you expand on that concept. But I wonder how well that is understood in India, whether there is a coherent strategy coming from India towards maritime or anything else for that matter. And it also begs questions about, more broadly than India, China and Yuan in Southeast Asia as well, about transparency, trust and cooperation between the various regional states and non-regional states and littoral players, and where you see that heading in this framework of regional engagement and power projection. I mean, for example, you talked, Raja Mohan, about India developing power projection capabilities, but Rory, in his opening remarks, suggested that there was some conflict between regional engagement and power protection, or potentially, and you also mentioned that you didn't think there was a contradiction. So I think within that whole milieu, there are a range of issues that perhaps you could each expand upon in that context of coherency, transparency, trust and cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. You want to take that?
Thank you. I think good questions. A coherent strategy, as I said, this is work in progress. I mean, those of us who think India should become more navalist, it's a constant struggle, because that India has two very long borders. Both those borders are tense right now, and therefore the logic of the territorial defense, the traditional argument, continues to be relevant. But at the same time, that if you look at the long-term structural change of India's interests, then you're going to look at the maritime thing is going to get more and more important for India. But this does not mean, I think India doesn't have to choose between being a continental power or maritime power, because much like China, I think a large Indian economy which spends only 2% of GDP on defense, out of which 20% goes to the Navy, that if India continues to grow, it will have the resources to build a significant Navy. But in the short term, of course, there are going to be a lot of ups and downs, but I think the direction as the India tries to secure its dispersed interests. As I said, 40% of its GDP is linked to rest of the world, major importer of natural resources, search for major markets. So I think the long-term drive would be, I think, a greater emphasis. I would want to sum up what should be India's coherent strategy. I would say hold the north, consolidate the south in the maritime domain, and look east, I would say, and the last two components are essentially naval. The second part, I think, on transparency, I think we've come a long way. I think there was a time when our friends in Southeast Asia, when our friends in Australia was very worried about India's relationship with the Soviet Union. Everybody thought the Soviet Navy was all over the Indian ports. But I think since then, in fact, one of the first naval diplomatic acts that India did was to actually call the Southeast Asian countries for the joint exercises around the Andaman Islands. That's way back in 92, 93. Since then, I think there has been expansive engagement, not only bilaterally, trilaterally, for example, in the Malacca Straits, and multilateral. That India is today far more engaged in multilateral diplomacy, naval diplomacy, whether it is the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, or the range of exercises it does through Milan. There is a significant expansion, and I think there is much greater trust. Our problem today is India is not able to meet the demand. That there is so much demand for Indian cooperation that India's the challenge is how do you meet those demands, whether it is, as I said, from Mauritius, Seychelles on one side to South China Sea. I mean, the demands are large, and how does India manage that? I mean, that is so creating more domestic capacities is the real issue. In terms of engagement and power projection, look, I think there is a difference clearly. I mean, I think one is you engage everyone, but people also would want India to shape the balance of power. Some of our friends in Southeast Asia want India to do more, probably sell arms, do more, make yourself present in a more sustained basis. That India has, I think India right now is quite prudent. I mean, it's not trying to inject itself into power politics or change it in any direction, but be a benign player at this point, doing enough to support others and to create options for our friends in Southeast Asia and other places so that the strong Indian Navy could eventually contribute to a more stable order in Asia.
Thanks for that. Yeah, please go on.
Nice to see you, Lee. Just brief comments. One, a kind of general point. Actually, first of all, you asked me about the contradiction, whether there is a contradiction between power projection and engagement. I mean, what I meant to describe is that in the sort of simple Venn diagram, there is a shading overlap area between the two. But I think it's in the eye of the beholder. And since the subject was perceptions, I just flagged that there is that grey area in which I think the ambiguity and the mischief actually lies. On transparency, I think generally we've tended to have over-high expectations of transparency. Certainly in the relationship with China, I think by putting transparency as a sort of shibboleth that it would automatically deliver confidence and trust, I think was misplaced. And the obvious way to turn that around is United States is the most openly, almost embarrassingly transparent military system in the world, but it doesn't prevent power motivations from being read from China and others. So I think that there are limits to it. It delivers positives, but that really gets to the other point, the missing ingredient of trust. And trust is the real chicken and egg problem. Certainly if you're coming to confidence building measures or crisis management measures, such as INCSEs or direct crisis communication hotlines, when one side insists on trust as a prerequisite in order to put the arrangements in place, which is a sort of against the Western dominant mode of thought. But from the other side, the suspicion often is that dialogue will actually then be used to legitimate naval activities, which are actually the main source of tension in any case. So no easy to answer to those both, but I think transparency for me is probably on a lower ranking of priorities.
We'll take a few more questions that, just on your point there, Lee, about the tension or the contradiction. I guess I was thinking that the platforms you need for power projection are sometimes the very platforms that make the need for engagement all the greater. So maybe it's a paradox rather than a contradiction, but just trying to be slightly provocative. Thank you for picking up on that. We've got two, I think, members of the audience just here over on my right.
Good afternoon, David Palmer. Dr. Moha, am I correct in saying India is about to acquire nuclear submarines?
Yes.
Then I ask you, sir, what do you see, or what does India see a nuclear submarine achieving that a conventional boat cannot? And are you running the risk of opening the gates of Southeast Asian arms race? Thank you.
I don't think India needs to open up an arms race. I mean, I think an arms race is already on. With the fundamental shift in the US-China maritime balance, the expansion of the Chinese military power, everyone is buying submarines. That is the current trend. So I don't think it is anything rooted with India, because those in South China Sea today, where Vietnam has bought 6 kilo class, Indonesians, I believe, are looking for some. Singapore has a pretty good submarine capability. So I think that exists. So this idea that there is an arms race, I mean, as a fundamentally a negative thing, the question is, how, if Asian waters are becoming more important, if the smaller states, the middle powers want to protect their positions, I think submarines are one good way of going about it, and I think that's what most people are doing. As far as Indian nuclear submarine is concerned, I mean, I think India is building conventional submarines as well. I mean, I think the nuclear submarine is essentially two parts to it. I mean, one is as part of building a nuclear triad, because what we are, the indigenous submarine that India is building, the Arihant, is a SSBN, and India is also, way back in the 1980s, we got a nuclear-powered submarine from the Russians. Now we're getting another one. So what we have is developing the operational experience of operating the nuclear submarines, eventually have some number of SSNs which would give India significant reach and the capacity to prevent any kind of hostile activity in the Indian Ocean.
Thanks. I think we've got another question over here on the right. I promise I won't prejudice against the left if I see hands raised there, please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's Daniel Lord here from, I'm the Staff Officer Information Warfare at the Australian Maritime Warfare Centre. I've got a question more for you, and based on your experience within Singapore, where you're operating from at the moment, and it's to do with the strength and importance of the five-power defence arrangement. Based on the history of the FPDA, it was formed primarily with withdrawal of the United Kingdom, obviously, from Singapore for the affording of protection to both Singapore and Malaysia should any event happen in that region, with the formation of an operational headquarters based out of, primarily for the HQIAD's perspective, out of Butterworth. Now, over time, that's gone from having a number of operational squadrons under an Air Vice Marshal from Australia's operational command into more conducting an exercise-based set of scenarios over there. What my question is getting at now is the importance of FPDA as strong now, do you believe, as what it once was when it was stood up, based on we now primarily only conduct exercises rather than have an operational operational footing there? But also, is there potential, do you think, from Singapore's eyes, that we could potentially grow that FPDA nature back into an operational headquarters again, which has a collegiate approach to operations in the Southeast Asian area of operations, and maybe a stronger role also for Singapore to play, noting that she is moving away from her traditional brown water navy into a more blue water navy, with also the ability with her amphibious platforms to provide support throughout the region?
On the latter point, I'm just not close enough to the RSN's thinking to really have a sense of that, but intuitively it makes sense that the Singaporeans would want to maximise FPDA, which is why I mentioned that potential sensitivity. Not that I think Indonesia is seen as the unspoken threat. Certainly that part of the dynamic has changed from when FPDA was born sort of in the immediate aftermath of confrontation, and that clearly was part of the unspoken background. I think the other part of the background that has clearly shifted is the FPDA was its other main de facto role was as a way of keeping Malaysia and Singapore talking to each other, and the fact that relationship now is probably at an all-time high. And in fact, for that matter, I'd characterize Singapore-Indonesia relations at an all-time high. So it has morphed, as all alliances and quasi-alliances have to, that are around for that length of time. I think the key to its survival is the fact that it's flexible and that it's not overly demanding of its participants either. It's a key caveat. It's an agreement to consult. It's not an Article 5 type binding defence arrangement, and that I think may also be the constraint on its the development along the operational lines that you've talked about. But I think it couldn't, in the same way that, like a lot of these arrangements, like the San Francisco system, you couldn't reinvent it now, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful. And I think the fact that it's Southeast Asia's only multilateral defence grouping, I think gives it a sort of cachet value to its Southeast Asian members. And of course, I mean, the question not for me to answer here, there are many in the room who could do it better, but given that Australia, I think, is the one that brings more assets to FPDA than any other partner now, really the future of FPDA, in my view, is more in your hands than anyone else's.
Touche. One here, thank you, in the front of the room, in the middle.
So I'm Lieutenant Commander Tayyib, Pakistan Navy from Australian Defence College. And as our respectable speaker highlighted, that India is very engaged in the region for cooperative maritime security. My question is, what are the impediments for India to joining existing cooperative maritime security arrangements, which have been started by US under the UN Security Council resolutions like counter-piracy or North Arabian Sea? And my second part is there any tension points between India's look east policy and China's go west and harmonious sea policies? Thank you.
I think good questions. I mean, I think that India is one of the most active navies in the Gulf of Aden, and that India is contributing to the anti-piracy effort. The problem is that does it participate under the umbrella which Pakistan is part of it, and you have a whole NATO, EU, a whole range of other groups that are operating there. As I said, this is the tension, that do you work as a power, do you submit yourself to other groupings, the terms of which are being defined by the others? As I said, that is part of the tension. But I think in terms of the outcomes, there's no real difference because India is contributing, India is coordinating with the Chinese, with the Japanese, and the Koreans in terms of how to schedule the patrolling activity in the Gulf of Aden. Second, I think I don't see, in fact, my whole book is about the overlapping footprints of the Indian Navy and the Chinese Navy in the coming years, because China has, I believe, genuine interest in the Indian Ocean. Those interests are going to grow by each passing day. Similarly, India is going to make its presence felt in the Western Pacific increasingly. So there is going to be some friction. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And I think the wisdom in Beijing and Delhi, I think, is about recognizing the emerging frictions between the two of them and to find ways in which they can cooperate. My sense is, in fact, India and China have begun a maritime dialogue. They're going to explore potential ways in which they can cooperate with each other. Because from the Indian perspective, the Chinese Navy is going to be in the Indian Ocean. I mean, it's not whether we like it or not, it's going to be a reality. Similarly, just as Indian Ocean is not India's ocean, South China Sea is not China's sea, there is going to be India and other people present there. So I think the challenge is, given how do you minimize the friction that's going to come? How do you expand the areas of cooperation between India and China? So I think we're beginning, for the first time, really embarked on a maritime dialogue with China, and I'm quite hopeful that it'll produce some results in the coming years.
One of the more memorable lines of the conference, I think, India's ocean is not India's ocean, the South China Sea is not China's sea. It'll be interesting to see if others have different views. We'll take one more question before I begin to close proceedings. So if I can see a hand raised somewhere. Aha, far left at the top at last.
Hello, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Bassingthwaighte, Force Development Army, and about to take over the 2nd Battalion and be the Commander of Australia's Landing Forces. Noting the comments from the first session from Professor Maitken about a key element of deterrence and reassurance is communication, and that there's two parts of communication, one what the speaker means to say and one that the audience hears. What is India and Southeast Asia hearing with the development of Australia's enhanced amphibious capability?
Do you want to take that first, Ewan? You're closer to home.
The question was about India specifically.
No, India and Southeast Asia.
India and Southeast Asia. Well, I think it's a wider question, not just about the development of amphibious capabilities, but also about the attitude towards the marine presence in the Northern Territory and the growing role of the United States around Indonesia, which initially sparked some concern whether that might feed an encirclement narrative in Jakarta. And if not in reality, then maybe at least it would give some ammunition to that as a populist line, which maybe in the course of a future election could come into play. Now, I don't think that's actually really a significant risk. I think for reasons actually that have been covered in previous sessions, the Indonesians are more likely to understand the limitations to that and maybe even to respond positively to the new opportunities that arise with the Americans being proximate. But I think that I would class it in that it's part of the the wider dimension of the strategic rebalance and Indonesian concerns and Australia's role within that, and seeing two admittedly capable and large amphibious ships posing a step change in Australia's intentions towards the region. Maybe capabilities is a different issue. The South Pacific, I think, is the region that wasn't mentioned, but I mean that's where I see the more likely potential for their use.
I don't think India will have any problems with Australian amphibious capabilities. In fact, India, I think, from my view, that there should be more cooperation between India and Australia to strengthen more cooperation on the both on the special forces and on the amphibious operations, because we're sufficiently far away from each other not to threaten each other, and we have sufficiently shared interests in this part that we need to work together. There was a point in the past, as Australians were suspicious of the Indian Navy, Indians had problems with Australia's policies, but I think that's all way behind us today. I think one of the significant things that's happened in the region in the last 10 years, both the Labour Party and the Liberal Party in Australia have invested extraordinary amount of political capital in transforming the relationship with India. We have a joint declaration on maritime security. We have stepping up. Our defense minister was in Australia in June. For the first time ever, an Indian defense minister came here. So there is much that India and Australia can do together in the coming years. In fact, Rory and I will be working on a thing that actually an India-Australia defense cooperation can become a part of what Ivan talked about, a middle power coalition, that you create enough regional capabilities that we share, we build, we help each other. That, I think, where India and Australia, given our history, our shared history, looking back at last 200 years, there's much there that we need to rediscover, and there's much that India and Australia are going to do in the coming years together.
I'm going to seize that moment to just give a plug to a talk that Roger's giving tomorrow at the Lowy Institute on this very topic. So if you want to hear more, please check the Lowy website or touch base with me afterwards. We've got time just to, I guess, touch on one more issue, and I want to abuse the privilege of being chair to ask this question, and I'll go to you, Ewan, because you made an interesting distinction between maritime and, I guess, mainland Southeast Asia, if we can call it that. We'll leave the peninsulas aside. Where do you see Vietnam in this maritime mainland divide that you say is becoming, in some ways, sharper than ever? And I guess further to that, what do you see as the potential for others to partner with Vietnam on maritime security?
I asked that question to some interlocutors in Hanoi in the last 10 days and got the reply back, where does Vietnam see its identity? Because clearly in a strictly geographical sense it fits more into the continental mould, having a land border. He replied that historically Vietnam sees its identity as couched in Indochina, as maybe, the sort of the French colonial construct, and that still has a powerful continuing influence. And we see the accommodation, for example, that Vietnam has reached on the land border with China. I think the nuances in the relationship between Vietnam and China as embodying a sort of paradox of coexistence and conflict. But the conflict, no coincidence, I think, is mainly on the maritime area, and we see those two contending identities pulling Vietnam, I think, in different directions. Economically, there is a powerful logic for Vietnam also to become more maritime in nature. That's where the bulk of its oil and gas deposits and therefore a lot of its future development will take it. And I think Vietnam also, important distinction, actually thinks about these issues. It thinks strategically in ways that aren't echoed in many other places in Southeast Asia. And I think it's a complicated strategy that Vietnam may be not totally coherent either, but there's certainly a strong sense that Vietnam is hailing on all channels at the moment and trying to internationalize to the maximum possible extent. But I think within that, there is a clear sense that internationalization of the South China Sea is one diplomatic objective, and that the logic of that pulls Vietnam into a much more maritime-based network of strategic and economic relationships. But you can't tow Vietnam away in the end. I mean, it will have to continue to have this double-edged relationship with China. And I think that's why it's also critical to talk to Vietnam on China, because it has also the alternative party channel that others don't. And I think a sophisticated reading of the Chinese mindset that others lack.
Rajal, we've got a minute to go, so I want you to have the last word. And I know that the India-Vietnam relationship has been an interesting one and is developing in intriguing ways. So please, do you have something to add on Vietnam?
I think many people see, India-Vietnam relationship as something recent, but I think it goes back to the 80s, where India was one of the few countries that supported Vietnamese intervention to end the genocide in Cambodia. Nobody gave us lectures on humanitarian intervention those days, but of course we paid a big price for supporting Vietnam at that point. But I think this idea that India, Vietnam have strong sense of working together, that endures. I think that goes back to the 70s and the 80s. What we're seeing today is a significantly expanded cooperation, because today the circumstances have changed. India has more resources to offer. There is, I think, in the last few years, I think there has been a significant expansion. As I said, a lot going on the training side. There's a lot likely possible on Indian financial support for Vietnam to acquire some vessels, OPVs and other ships from India. Then there is, Vietnam has been generous in offering access to India to do more frequent visits to its ports, and that India is now more continually present out there. So I think it's just the, shall we say, the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
Look, we have to end it there. I think we've had an insightful and in some ways provocative session, because we've looked at both the prospects and the limits for engagement. I think we're looking at some new partnerships forming in the region, new ways of thinking about the region, and I think we've begun a conversation that we'll certainly carry forward. There's a few lessons in this for Australia as it tries to allocate finite resources to a whole range of important maritime engagement relationships. I want you to show your appreciation for our colleagues, and we'll see you later in the conference. Thank you.